Okay, well, good afternoon everyone, and welcome to the research seminar series of the School of Political Science and International Studies here at the University of Queensland. It's a great pleasure to introduce our speaker, Dr. Tom Pegram, University College London, where Tom is also the Deputy Director of the Centre for Global Governance. And Tom is currently a visiting fellow here at Pulses. Tom's research interests include global governance, international organizations, and the regulatory politics of human rights compliance. He has published widely. In fact, it's quite impressive, Tom's publications. So he's published widely on these topics, including in journals such as International Organization, European Journal of International Relations, Human Rights Quarterly, the Annals of the American Academy of Political Science, and the Journal of Latin American Studies, just to give you a flavor of Tom's work and interest. Not quite. I selected a few. Anyway, great having you here, Tom, and without further ado, over to you.
Thank you, Eloise. Great to be here. Thanks to Shahar, thanks to the school for this opportunity. I've definitely found being 10 hours ahead of London has helped keep the office at bay, and I've actually got some work done, so I really appreciate that. Also really enjoyed the masterclass on Wednesday. I see some familiar faces here. Thanks for coming for a second helping. That day we were really doing global governance and what is to be done. It's also what I'm working with Shahar on. But today I'm going to change hats and actually present on my current human rights research. So this is a project that I'm really quite excited about. It's really building on a lot of research I've been doing over recent years, well, amazingly more than a decade now, on national human rights institutions. This is the sort of triptych of a collaboration with Catherine Linos, who's a law professor at Berkeley. And we're really excited about this one. We think it is going to be a major contribution to both the scholarship and hopefully the practitioner debate in the field. Our target journal is AJIL, the American Journal of International Law. And one of the reasons for that is that it gives you a whopping 30,000 words to play with, which is nice in this day and age. So we have some really rich case study materials in there. We have 4 case studies, all of them clocking in for around 4,000 to 5,000 words. Of course, that also poses a challenge today. I'm going to try and condense all 30,000 words into about 35, 40 minutes. So without further ado, as we'll get cracking. So NHGRIs then. NHGRIs are independent, state-funded national agencies specifically designed to promote and protect human rights. So the Australian Federal Human Rights Commission would be the example here. And these are one of the liberal structures that have experienced extraordinary diffusion over the last 20 years or so, as represented here in this chart. And this has been spurred on by the international sort of fashion of the day, by a lot of UN advocacy promoting these agencies, but also by domestic demand for human rights protections and for more accountable governments. In another paper, the IO piece that I published with Katarina, we look at the role of the UN, and in particular the role of a soft standard, the Paris Principles, which are UN-endorsed standards on NHGRI form and function. They were adopted in 1993, and we essentially explore how they catalyzed, they triggered this extraordinary norm cascade through into the early 2000s, beginning to plateau now, but the numbers are still climbing. So what we have today is NHGRIs all over the world. I mean, you find NHGRIs in every subcontinent. You can find them in democracies. You find them in stable autocracies. Here's a few of their, the smorgasbord of colourful symbolism of the NHGRI world. They normally come in the form of human rights ombudsmen or human rights commissions. There are various sort of fringe variants, so institutes and others, but principally those are the 2 dominant models. And we know a lot about why NHGRI spread. There's been a lot of scholarship on that. Sonia Cardenas probably the starting gun in 2003, and then we've all piled in. We know a lot less about basically how they operate in practice and when and why they actually matter for securing human rights improvements. And I think that's a pretty important research question, one that has been pending for probably too long, and particularly important for victims of human rights violations who find that they have a little recourse to justice. Now, it's easy to be cynical about these institutions, no doubt. But the evidence suggests that at least some NHRIs are contributing significantly to improving human rights, or at least to promoting and protecting human rights. Sometimes at great personal risk in very hostile settings. So, we've had local commission personnel killed in Afghanistan, in Colombia, in other dangerous settings. I'm sure all of you were tweeting the hashtag in the top left corner last year when Gillian Triggs went toe-to-toe with our illustrious UQ alumni George Brandis over the Forgotten Children report. We have the Northern Ireland Human Rights Commission coming out in 2003 condemning the Iraq war as a violation of international law. I don't think that it should be underestimated. The kind of bravery that requires in that particular time and context. That headline on the Philippines, I think if you were reading that, you might think that's just clearly a whitewash. But anyone who's familiar with the situation will know that there's absolutely no love lost between President Duterte and the head of the current Human Rights Commission. Indeed, Leonard de Lima, the former head of commission, is currently in prison for trumped-up drug charges. So it's a very serious situation. Again, I think bravery on display there. And then a case which is close to my own heart. I've done a lot of work on Peru. We have an image from the street protests in 2013, the banner "National Shame." This was essentially when the government appointed a stooge to the Human Rights Ombudsman's office, and essentially the people mobilised, and Humala had to intervene and annul the appointment. So some interesting dynamics going on there that I think are worth exploring. Of course, on the flip side, it's not too hard to find examples of failure as well. So here we have the Economist's verdict on the Mexican Human Rights Commission in 2008, absolutely correct, and there indeed is the former commissioner now. Street protests against him erupted in 2014, guilty for essentially suppressing human rights allegations. We have the Ramon Custodio Lopez from Honduras, who essentially supported the military coup in 2009. We have criticism of many NHRIs being established in the Middle East that lack many safeguards that we'd associate with the Paris Principles and design standards. And then issues of corruption and so on. So I think, this wide range of experience opens up a range of really interesting empirical questions. Firstly, what makes NHRIs effective, and also what explains the variation among these structures post-delegation, right, once they're operational. So that would be the premise, and this is how we enter the topic. We share the preoccupation of many human rights scholars regarding the compliance gap, right, between international standards and their instantiation in practice. Our starting point in terms of developing a theoretical argument here is to think about formal design effects. So the assumption being that formal design matters. At the same time, of course, we're very keen to ensure that we avoid the pitfalls of assuming formal rules have any determinative impact. And similarly, we're also keen to avoid the, pitfalls of the political science scholarship, especially in the principal agent field, which has obsessed over agency constraint to the detriment of thinking, theorizing about enabling agency, which obviously is pretty important as well. Now, I suppose the key caveat here is it's crucial not to conflate formal rules with action on the part of the agent. So, formal design matters, we think, as a basis for justification in terms of independent action, in terms of exploring that range of discretion that an agent might have. It also matters in terms of justification of enabling principled agency, if you will. And by sort of opening up that inquiry into the enabling properties of formal rules, we also are very interested in sources of endogenous change, so within these organizations, as well as positive and negative feedback effects. So, it's an ambitious project in a sense, and of course, we are trying to get a grip on the causal story, and I'll get into that in a second. But we see scholars such as Daniel Carpenter, Abraham Newman. I found this fantastic article by Hyman and Kovacic in the public administrative law field. We find their work very helpful, and they seek to trace bureaucratic autonomy in part back to agency structure, particularly thinking about how agency structure can enable organizational leadership, can enable coalition building, and can enable reputational gains. So we think this is a useful line of analysis. Of course, the jury is still out on how exactly agency design affects outcomes, and there's a very rich debate within the practitioner human rights field on this very question. So, how do we begin? Well, the first task is to conceptualize formal design. So the orthodox view here is that more safeguards are better, right? That the more of all of these different kinds of safeguards that an agency has, the stronger their performance will be in practice. And that's the assumption that we're really trying to interrogate. And we have a data set on 22 different design dimensions of 109 NHRIs. That's an awful lot of data to work with. So we aggregate that data set into 4 categories here. Really going along with UN guidelines, Paris principles, along with practitioner insights as well. And a large section of the opening of the paper is developing a series of theoretical conjectures around particular design features. So why would we expect independent safeguards to matter, right? So it's really reaching all the way back into the 1970s and work by Olson and others on regulatory capture. And we're developing a range of theoretical conjectures there, before we move to subjecting 2 of those to in-depth analysis through case study research. Now the other, of course, really tricky thing here, I'm sure everyone's picked up on this, is how you conceptualize effectiveness, right? Mm-hmm. So effectiveness is notoriously tricky, and in fact actually I'm quite allergic to the very term itself. I normally use impact or performance, but we think we should engage this head on. So the OHCHR provides one point of departure. Now there's 2 major problems with thinking about effectiveness in terms of human rights outcomes. First is the possibility that NHRIs are doing a really fantastic job, but they're encountering very stiff resistance, so there's absolutely no difference in terms of aggregate improvements. So Afghanistan might be a case in point, for example. The second key problem, of course, is it's sort of reversed, and you have there may be a selection bias. So you're essentially looking at NHRIs that are operating within countries that would have improved regardless of the existence of an NHRI, because the government is sincerely committed to improving the situation. Now the issue is, of course, the data, the quality of the data, and there's a huge debate going on about that, and one which I'm involved in a bit myself, particularly regarding torture violations. So, what do we do? Well, we use 2 other measures. So we try and triangulate, and we're not assessing effectiveness in terms of human rights outcomes. Instead, we focus on the agency itself. There is another paper which uses aggregate outcomes. It finds that the presence of an NHRI does lead to an improvement in physical integrity scores. It's by Francisco Ramirez. It's a sociological paper. So we leave that to them. What we're doing is we use one letter grades issued by the UN-affiliated peer review mechanism, the NHRI Subcommittee on Accreditation, which essentially awards grades A, B, C to NHRIs according to their compliance with the Paris principles. And they've moved increasingly into performance assessment. And we use another measure, which is an expert survey, which we conducted, a very detailed one, both quantitative and qualitative. But again, there are important limitations here. Obviously, expert surveys are perceptions of effectiveness, not actual effectiveness. Also, NHRI design generally stays very stable over time, so what you can actually do with it in terms of quantitative analysis is rather limited. So essentially what we do here is, because this is really the first systematic effort to assess NHRI design effects, we we explore a range of broad theoretical conjectures, and we arrive at these interesting, significant correlational findings. But really, to tell you the causal story, we need to move to qualitative research and to case studies, which is where I'm going to turn to now. So we find that complaint handling appears to be particularly significant, regardless of context. So we take that correlation and we're going to explore that in detail. We also find that promotional safeguards seem to matter, they seem to have a conditional effect, and we're particularly interested in their potential impact within transitional and authoritarian settings. So we take that hypothesis as well. So we're going to explore those two claims through a most similar research design, broadly speaking, identifying variation on those dimensions. Now, ideally, assignment of these design features is externally given, right? And here we're assisted somewhat by the fact that design of these institutions was driven principally by external factors, particularly the UN principles. And we see, of course, that the institutions in Peru and in the Philippines were actually established before the General Assembly adopted the Paris principles, whereas Malaysia and Chile were adopted some years after. And indeed, we see much more conformity with the UN standards in those two later bodies. But yeah, case matching is inevitably imperfect as well. So we also sought to select cases that may disconfirm the theory. So in Peru, we have a harder human rights context. So if it was context driving the results, we would expect Peru to essentially perform worse than Chile. That's not actually what we find in the evidence. And the Philippines is no more hostile to human rights context, at least at point of establishment, than the Malaysian case. But again, all comparative exercises match imperfectly, and the cases do differ in very important respects. And I've worked a lot in Latin America, that is my training, very obviously familiar with the differences between Peru and Chile. And I think first one can say, well, these cases merit attention in any case on their own terms. I mean, also having done a lot of research in these countries, I mean, the issue of closing that compliance gap does raise pressing challenges and concerns regardless of the relative performance of the democratic rule of law context. So that's how we essentially arrive at the cases and the selection. As I say, we're now moving to detailed case study analysis within the paper, and we're trying to be pretty state-of-the-art on the method, because also the method conversations are really gaining traction now in the law field, and we're hoping that this paper might be a valuable showcase in terms of how to do really good within case study analysis. So we essentially, though, good case study analysis boils down to asking the right questions to arrive at valid inference. So we essentially apply the same questions to all the cases. So questions are directed to, if an NHGRI does have complaint handling powers, does it use them? Does it use them frequently? Does it use them effectively? How do these mechanisms actually matter? Even if we think they might not matter, right? I mean, so perhaps also pushing the counterintuitive angle. And what happens when these institutions lack these formal powers or safeguards? Can creative leaders within NHGRIs carry out these activities regardless? Do they have that discretionary space? And of course, another key concern is what happens to NHGRIs that are seeking to exploit these formal powers in different settings, either where an executive is perhaps friendly or supportive of what the NHGRI is trying to do, or indeed where it's hostile to the NHGRI's activities. And within these cases, of course, we do have change over time. So Peru, Malaysia, these are contexts which have moved from authoritarian to democratic settings. And also we have some rather interesting parallel situations going on where an NHGRI's work on one particular rights set may indeed be supported by the executive, while at the same time NHGRI's work in another area is strongly rebuked. So some rather curious dynamics to unpack there within the cases. Now, as I say, the study is pretty large. So there's too much text on this slide alone, but it's about as much as I could boil it down to. And we can obviously get into more detail on the empirics in the Q&A. And these are the sort of the summary tables, a few more columns, but these are the summary tables that preview the case study work within the paper. This is the Latin American cases, so we're looking at the importance of protective design functions, in particular complaint handling powers. And what we find is that the presence of complaint handling powers in Peru has indeed been an important source of strength for the institution. It's allowed the office to scale up individual complaints. It's allowed the office to engage in big national policy debates on key issues. It's allowed them to essentially accumulate complaints to address structural violations, and it's been a source of legitimacy. The fact that it has that direct interface with the citizen. And we go into some detail on various cases, and there is a strategic element to this as well, of course. I mean, as soon as the NHGRI got off the ground, it immediately seized upon probably one of the biggest hot potatoes of 1996 in Peru, which was all of these thousands of Peruvians who were in prison on dubious terrorism charges. Many families were arriving at the office on day one when it opened its doors. It was getting thousands of complaints. And it managed to negotiate the establishment of an ad hoc commission presided over by the church, by various congressmen. Fujimori was willing to accept that in terms of, for the international dividends, in terms of reputation. And indeed there was some success in getting many Peruvians released from prison. So immediately the Ombudsman was translating complaint handling into political dividends. And if you look at the popularity polls, and it's rather useful in Latin America, they're really keen on statistics. There's loads of these opinion polls all over the place. It experienced its highest approval ratings up to the year 2000, when it went essentially toe-to-toe with the Fujimori regime, when the regime tried to secure a third term in office, which is another story. Another key case would be the highly controversial issue of forced sterilisation of indigenous women. Again, these were complaints that were trickling in, often through intermediaries in the church. Local NGOs are arriving at the Ombudsman's office, and it decided to open up, it had a very impressive head of women's rights at the time, and she decided to open up an investigation. Many people probably have heard about that. I mean, that arrived all the way to the Inter-American Court on Human Rights, and reparations and so on are still being played out within Peru. So it had a political nous combined with that the ability to capitalise on its formal powers in that sense. Perhaps the feedback effect, which was perhaps more surprising or less obvious, talking with former officials and others and NGO personnel, was the more maybe prosaic socialisation effects. So, for example, one area where the NHGRI was quite successful was public utilities, particularly newly privatised public utilities. There was a lot of citizen grievance around the performance of these private utilities. Fujimori was quite willing to allow the Defensoría to proceed with those investigations. And this official who I spoke with recalled a dramatic effect of informing complainants that they were under no obligation to pay unfair or incorrect water charges prior to disputing the amount. And he said, in his words, suddenly we had 1,500 complaints. The people were suddenly empowered against the administration, It was, in a sense, a cultural change, and the complaints served to achieve this. They suddenly discovered their right to complain, and that's something which we heard through various individuals that we spoke with. So complaint handling in this case had rather interesting feedback effects in that sense. Positive and negative, we could say. I mean, the positive ones might be that you have large volumes of complaints, and the complaints just grow and grow and grow. We've got the statistics on that. I mean, they now get more than 100,000 complaints a year. Coupled with massive decentralisation of its operations through the national territory, that provided real leverage in its budget negotiations. And the budget has increased, progressively increased, even though the government has not been its biggest fan in recent years. But it also perhaps has certain negative consequences, potentially, particularly in terms of inflated expectations. Of course, the NHGRI does not have enforcement authority. There is that risk that you have desperate individuals coming to the office and finding that the NHGRI cannot actually offer meaningful redress if their pensions are not getting paid, or they're not getting their kidney dialysis and so on. So that may be some of the risks. And turning to Chile, Chile's a really interesting case. Why does Chile not have complaint handling powers? I had a friend from NYU who sent me the best empirical smoking gun you can get, which was essentially this extremely detailed congressional transcript, which had the minister arguing with various human rights representatives about including complaint handling powers within the structure. And they said essentially, well, the Paris Principles don't require complaint handling powers, therefore we're not going to provide those within the structure. So the fact that the Paris Principles left it as optional has had very significant effects in terms of actual implementation. And we argue that it has hampered the effectiveness of the Chilean office in a range of ways. I mean, one is that it does receive many complaints, and it sought to essentially expand its mandate by saying the power to receive any information also includes receiving complaints. But it has no mandate to essentially process those complaints. It has no obligation to resolve them in any fashion. And coupled with a very narrow legal prescriptive jurisdiction over torture violations, but not other grave violations, it often has to essentially reject the majority of those complaints. And I had the privilege of being invited out by the Chilean office last March, and it's kind of crazy. I went out for 4 days. I flew out after teaching, and then I sort of just flew straight back. But I was able to do 2 workshops, one at the university, as sort of a closed door one with various senior officials, and then I was also in a big debate on reforming Chilean human rights frameworks. But the closed door one was fascinating. Essentially, they were arguing, well, it just doesn't matter, right? That we already have all of these institutions. Chile is a democracy. It's a very dense framework. So that was obviously an issue which I had to address. So I kind of pushed hard on that point. And what is really revealed is that there are many institutions in Chile, no doubt, but none of them have an explicit human rights mandate, and none of them would meet the Paris Principles standards. And what you find is actually that many infractions, human rights infractions, are not legal breaches. They're not torture. Often human rights violations are actually omissions or neglect. So people aren't getting washed in psychiatric facilities, whatever it may be. And those sorts of violations, really, there's no point of redress, no obvious point of redress within the Chilean state. So that was essentially the argument that we developed within the case study, drawing on various sources and conversations. And there is a lot of mobilisation now in Chile to establish a bona fide human rights ombudsman to address that gap, particularly for vulnerable groups such as children, prisoners, and so on. So we draw on some of that debate as well to make the case. Now, at the same time, what's interesting with the Chilean case is that there's a clear demand for a human rights institution, and it has performed, I think, above expectations. And it has aggressively gone after the government on issues of torture and other serious violations. But on the more sort of day-to-day level, it's struggled to consolidate its image as a bridge between state and citizen. And there is, again, the negative feedback effect of inflated expectations. That's something which is acute in the Chilean case. So that's American cases. Happy to share the paper. onto the Asia-Pacific cases. So here we're exploring the importance of promotional powers, in particular the ability to advise on legislation, educational functions, and to issue reports and special reports on key issues. And what really comes through it here is how NHGRIs use these kinds of powers differently under diverse contexts, exploiting different kinds of political openings. And what comes through very strongly is the role of individual leadership. So in Malaysia, we have an NHGRI established by an authoritarian government in 1999. It is granted broad promotional powers in accordance with the Paris Principles, but it's also stripped of many of the independent safeguards that we'd associate with the institution. So, for instance, it's unique among all NHGRIs for granting commissioners only a 2-year term, subject to renewal. And they don't often get renewed. Well, if they do, yeah. But nevertheless, committed NHGRI heads have, from time to time, and more often than not, frankly, used these broad promotional powers to generate extensive media coverage and to expose and publicise serious government abuse. So there's been a range of reports, special reports, particularly also facilitating civil society mobilisation. And I think it's important to understand the impact of civil society on the performance of the NHGRI. Civil society is highly mobilised in Malaysia, the Reformasi movement and so on. I'm sure that many people here are probably more expert in this than I am. And the NHGRI did not shy away from engaging issues of deaths in custody, police brutality, torture violations, freedom of assembly, unlawful arrest, violations of indigenous rights by transnational corporations. It's picked up a lot of hot potatoes over time. And it was very active in the Versailles demonstrations, 2.0, 4.0? Bercy, yeah, sorry. Very active there in terms of trying to protect freedom of assembly and to try and negotiate with the police to prevent violence. Because these demonstrations were unlawful, or deemed unlawful by the government. Many of his actions have provoked sharp rebuke by politicians and other powerful constituencies, including business. At the same time, the NHGRI has been subject to criticism by NGOs. I think very useful criticism. One, it's shied away from certain issues, particularly issues of freedom of religion, issues of LGBT rights. And it's also often struggled to translate or convert all of this activity into actual meaningful reform, although there are instances where it does seem to have achieved some modest reform in terms of police conduct, some legislation, and land reform. Now, if we turn to the Philippines, which of course is in the headlines now, this institution was established by Corazon Aquino in 1987. It's one of the first NHGRIs ever established in the world, which in itself is interesting. And it has a real lack of formal promotional powers. Yet its legal authority is very strong, although it has all the legal powers you can imagine, except the power to issue binding rulings. So that in itself poses a bit of a challenge. This highly legalised mandate led it to pursue a particular route, a particular strategy of change, which was prosecution of human rights violators. And that legal control approach was reinforced by a requirement that the majority of the commission be from the bar. So it was full of lawyers, basically. The first commissioner was herself a lawyer, and one with a somewhat dubious reputation. In any case, the NHGRI did dutifully file many human rights claims at the courts in the late 80s, early 90s, but it was an uphill battle. Of the 1,500 cases filed before the courts between 87 and 1990, only 11 resulted in sanctions, and whether they were actually enforced is difficult to ascertain. So you have a very problematic launch, shall we say, in this case. In terms of the significance of the lack of promotional powers, that really comes into view very clearly in 1994, when an entrepreneurial NHGRI head, a former permanent representative to New York for the Philippine government, Cedri Ordonez, became the chief commissioner and decided to experiment with a promotional mandate and really went full force into economic and social rights, developing a strategy of intervention. But quite quickly, this was shut down by the Supreme Court, who ruled that he had exceeded his formal mandate. And the court decision rested on a very close reading of the deliberations of the commission designers in '86. And again, you can go and have a look at that transcript. And it's quite fascinating, actually, the debates that these commissioners had in '86 about the purpose of this institution, why it should focus principally on or exclusively on civil and political violations, placing it in the context of the Marcos era, debating whether it should have a strong promotional mandate and deciding that no, that would essentially diffuse its authority. Very interesting transcript to take a look through. But the commission argued strongly against the claim, but of course the transcript is actually fairly definitive on this, and so it was shut down. And this failed experiment had rather unfortunate negative feedback effects as well. Essentially, the Commission reverted to a strong legal control approach. Over the next decade more, almost 20 years, there's very few educational promotional achievements that one can identify. But, and this is obviously the big idiosyncrasy, leadership again is massively important in understanding the Philippine experience. And the arrival of Leila de Lima in 2008 was not met with any fanfare by the NGO community. She was an obscure elections lawyer, had no human rights experience whatsoever, but the president quickly regretted that decision. She took the role extremely seriously and entered into a number of confrontations on various fronts with powerful actors in the Philippines, to the point where she was essentially she was appointed as the Minister for Justice in 2010, which may have been a political act to remove a troublesome individual from the Commission, although most NGO representatives that I spoke with suggested that was a positive move, that she could achieve more from that position, and indeed she continued to engage seriously on human rights issues as Minister, and now, as I mentioned, she finds herself in prison on trumped-up drug charges after having been the only senator really to take President Duterte to task for massive violations and massacres and so on. So, what we have here is NHGRI leadership that did experiment with promotional powers at different points, but at various times it has been curtailed in that action by its formal absence of powers. And indeed, Leila de Lima also mentioned the 1994 case, which is the Commission versus Simons, as a real problem, an obstacle that needs to be dealt with through legislation. But of course, there's very little support within Congress to resolve that matter for the Commission. Whirlwind tour then, through 4 cases. What are the key takeaways from this project? Well, first, we think that there is sufficient evidence there to suggest that formal rules do matter. And they may matter in unlikely settings as well, including transitional and authoritarian settings. That formal rules can play an important role in terms of enabling agency as much as constraining, but also constraints, of course. That they do limit the permissible activities of these regulatory agencies, but they also do serve as a basis, a justification for pushing the envelope, for independent action, principled agency to the margins or even perhaps beyond the scope of the rule as originally intended by their designers. Beyond complaint handling and promotional powers specifically, the other effects that we see that really came through inductively as we worked the cases was, one, that formal rules have a big effect on the internal workings of these institutions, particularly in how they structure hiring, how they structure priority setting, but also in terms of how they shape modes of resistance, So it was indeed, it was the attempt by the Philippine elite to shut the commission down relied upon its particular formal deficits, and it's also produced both positive and negative feedback loops within their political ecosystems. The other key finding, which is something which has always been prominent in my research, ever since I was first embedded within the Peruvian Ombudsman's office in 2005, when I started doing this research, is leadership. The importance of leadership among both the head of the office, but also many of the senior officials and indeed functionaries at lower tiers. And we do see evidence of principled, sometimes even heroic leadership, and sometimes by individuals that you wouldn't think it to look at them. So the first Malaysian commissioner, Musa bin Hitam, was the former deputy prime minister. We had a former prime minister in Peru, Beatriz Merino, who acquitted herself very well as ombudswoman in 2006 to 11. And we had various former permanent representatives to New York, so government officials, high-level government officials, Cedric Ordóñez in the Philippines, and also the current commissioner in Malaysia, Tan Sri Hasmi Agam, who also have taken the job seriously. But of course, poor leadership is also very much part of the story. And then finally, in terms of the bigger context and the international organisation implications, formal design recommendations is one of the very few levers that the UN has to try and influence human rights outcomes on the ground. And I think our study does suggest that although they are not sufficient to bring about change, they can be of significant help. I'll leave it there. Look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, Shaha.
Yeah, thanks, Tom. Really interesting study.